Critical theory is defined by Stanford University as a family of theories that aim at a critique and transformation of society by integrating normative perspectives with empirically informed analysis of society's conflicts, contradictions, and tendencies. According to those who were in favor of these theories, critical theory is not about understanding the world, it's about changing the world. It's about bringing society to a place where it should be. It's about equity, equal outcomes, and social justice. Now, all this sounds well and good, but is critical theory really the best for society? There are those who argue no, it's not. Dr. Sharon James is an author, public speaker, and social policy analyst with the Christian Institute, and she has written a paper entitled Critical Theory, Challenging Truth and Reality. And in this paper, Dr. James makes the point that critical theory is not good for society. And Dr. Sharon James joins me now to speak about this paper and her views on critical theory.
Great to speak with you, Arthur. Thank you for the invite.
There is a lot of pressures on people in this society today, especially in the Christian church, especially young people, not being able to say what they want to say, being forced more or less to conform and indeed to align themselves with the general thinking of society. How has society changed in this regard? Just give us an idea over the last maybe 10, 20 years. Speak to us a bit about this.
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm hearing from young people going to university or college, or even going into the workplace and getting what they are told is diversity training, which sounds marvellous, doesn't it? But they're being confronted with something called the wheel of oppression. Now, I wasn't given this when I went to university, but it's fairly common. Your listeners could just Google the wheel of power and privilege or the wheel of oppression. There are lots of different versions of it. But in the middle of this circle are males, whites, heterosexuals, people who are cisgender, comfortable in their body, and a whole bunch of other things. And we're privileged because we're on the inner circle. And then on the outer circle are people who are deemed or called oppressed, and they're the opposite of all of those things. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that Christians are now on the inner circle, and we're being told, well, we are an oppressor class. And I'm finding that young people are writing to me saying, I don't know what to do at university, because if I say that I'm a Christian, it's kind of social death. And if I say I'm pro-life, that's definitely social death. And all of these things happen very quickly. And people aren't quite sure where it came from or what to do with it. And it can have a silencing effect. And I'm sure that some of your listeners will have been very aware of some of the debates around cancel culture, where if you simply say something, certainly on the mainland, police might be after you for a perceived hate crime, a non-crime hate incident, they call them. There were 120,000 non-crime hate incidents in a 5-year period over here. So yeah, there's something strange going on in our culture that people are alarmed about, and I think quite rightly.
Okay, you've written a paper before entitled Critical Theory, Challenging Truth and Reality. In this, you speak about the cultural shift from objective facts to subjective feelings. Speak to us about this. Just I'll quickly read you a quote you've written in this. It's increasingly in our culture, individual experience, more particularly the individual experience of those deemed to be oppressed, settles every argument and overrides objective evidence. What is the point you're making in this?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll give you an example. Some of your listeners may have heard of an author called Rosaria Butterfield. Now, she was a professor of queer theory. She was an activist for LGBT issues. And then she was converted to Christianity, and she is now an author and a speaker. And she happened to be speaking in a meeting, and she happened to make a factual statement about a friend of hers, and she referred to large hands. Now, that was a point of fact because the person she was speaking about was over 6 foot tall and large in build. But she was accused of hate speech. And somebody had taken offence at that because the person in question was trans. And she was told, I don't care about your truth. Your truth hates my truth. Your truth hates my reality. Now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, many people wouldn't even have thought that made any sense. But in today's culture, that makes sense. Because if somebody is thought to be in an oppressed group, what they say about themselves, what they claim about themselves, can take precedence over biological fact or over actual reality. And I'll tell you why that's happened. And I'd like to put this simply. If you look at the textbooks on teaching social justice and teaching diversity, they will say up front there has been a redefinition of oppression. So when you talk about oppression, when I talk about oppression, we mean something like tyrannical treatment of the weak and the powerless. And that's really the biblical definition of oppression. And God hates it when powerless people are abused by wealthy rulers, for example. But in a key textbook, a lady called Iris Young says, in its current definition, oppression refers to the psychological disadvantage people feel if they are thought to be in a marginalized group. Psychological oppression, it's redefined. So if you talk about a mother and a father, that could be regarded as psychologically demeaning somebody who is trans. So there's been a redefinition of oppression. People who are thought to be oppressed, we mustn't offend them. We mustn't go against their claims. That is then thought to be hateful and oppressive. So there's been a lot of shifting of vocabulary going on. And a lot of the unease going on now is that people use certain words and think they know what they mean, words like justice. But there's been a sleight of hand, and those words actually mean something else to other people. And we are living in confusing times.
Okay. All this cultural shift, you make the point, you make the argument, it's all part of critical theory. Break down, what is critical theory? It's a huge subject, it's a huge area, but is it possible to synopsize it, break it down?
Yeah. Okay. So critical theory is an academic ideology that arose out of a study centre. I'll come back to that in a moment. But over the last century, it has morphed into a whole bunch of what are now called critical social theories. And there's a lot of common ground between the original ideology and the current critical social theories. But just so that your listeners understand where we are going to, those current critical social theories would include things like critical race theory, critical gender theory, and so forth. So this is where we're at now. But let's go back to where it came from. Just over 100 years ago, 1923, a Marxist study centre was founded in Germany. It would later become known as the Frankfurt School. And the Marxist founders of that school were very concerned that although the Communist Manifesto had been published way back in 1848, still, over 50 years later, the workers in most European countries had not risen up in revolution. Why? What had gone wrong? They need to be woken up to realise that it was urgent that they should, if you like, break off their chains. But the economic arguments weren't cracking it. Marx had always spoken about economic oppression, but actually the working classes in many European countries wanted the status quo to continue. They were quite happy with a stable life. They didn't want a revolution. But if you could add to the Marxist analysis of some people are economically oppressed, the Freudian analysis that multitudes of people are psychologically oppressed by traditional morality, the family, and all these authoritarian structures that are keeping them psychologically oppressed, that's a much more potent mixture. And if you go back to the original thinkers of the Frankfurt School, which I do in some of my longer books, they say that what they were aiming to do was not investigate traditional theories, which is all the ideas of science and history and philosophy and traditional academic disciplines. That's traditional theory. No, they were going to focus on critical theory, which is not about seeking truth and passing it on. It's about rousing people to action, praxis, effectively revolution. Critical theory is about raising the consciousness of people to realize that they are oppressed by forces bearing down on them that they don't really always label as oppressive. Things like the family. Fathers are oppressive Things like education. Teachers just teach people to be compliant and fit in with the status quo. Things like the legal system, which just operates to keep the rich in their places. All of the structures of society, they used a fancy word, the hegemony, all of those structures keep us psychologically oppressed. And they, as critical theorists, aim to wake us up to how we are all oppressed. I, as a woman, am oppressed by being in the patriarchal structure of marriage. I might say, I'm happy being a wife, I'm happy being a mother, I'm happy being a grandmother. Oh no, you're an oppressed female and the patriarchy is oppressing you. And if you don't realize it, you need to be woken up. It's that kind of thinking. Wake people up to their oppression. And this is now fed down into current critical social theories, which we could say more about later if you wish.
Okay. Well, on two sides, you've got your objective reality and you've got your, well, could say, subjective feelings. Those in favor of critical theory are arguing, well, look, the whole point here isn't to destroy, it isn't to do anything harmful, it's merely to address systemic injustices rather than deny objective truths. So, like, I mean, the whole point is like, no, we want to do good, we want to rebuild, we want to make things better, we want to improve. But then, of course, there's the argument of objective truth being eroded. So, how did the two of them
Well,
tell
I
us
wish
about
it
this?
was true, because if you go back, let's look at those two strands which were in the original framework of critical theory. Marxism, the Communist Manifesto, it says communism aims to abolish all eternal truths, all religion, and all morality. It's right there, Communist Manifesto. I think it's page 91, but if you really want to check it out. And then if you look at Freud, he's very much saying that what people feel, the instincts that we have must be privileged. And when you look at the architects of critical theory, not one of them believed in God, a creator, or design. They all believed that all that we see around us is socially constructed. And so that means that we can deconstruct it too. And if you fast forward to critical gender theory, even the most basic biological facts of male-female binary, which is the most fundamental fact of creation, they would say, no, if your feelings or orientation or whatever you want to call it, identity, self-claimed identity, goes against that, that must be privileged over the biological reality of the body. And so what I'm saying, I think, as a Christian, is that the solid ground of the Christian worldview is that we know that we are created and there is a design. And the fact that there is a creator and there is a design means that we can have a solid foundation of truth and reality. But once you deny creation, you deny design. We are very much in the shifting sands of saying, well, who would I be to tell you what is true? I have no authority to do that. Who would you be to tell me what is true? You have no authority. And you are down to the more than 7 billion people in this world, each with my perception, your perception, my truth, your truth, my morality, your morality, my claims, your claims. And then it actually does become who's stronger, who's more powerful. And we are in dangerous ground there.
Okay. Well, society has changed a lot over recent years. The meaning of a lot of words have changed. I mean, many years ago, gay meant to be happy. Now gay means something else. Of course, you've got like phobia means kind of an irrational fear, but now phobia means something else. So language is changing, types of changes. The way we interact and talk is changing as well. Like, from what I understand, the original thinkers of much of this critical theory that you're talking about, the people like Marx, people like Foucault, from what I understand, they had no interest in God whatsoever. But their argument is that they're fighting injustices. There have been injustices in society, and these injustices were corrected, and rightly so, things like slavery and so forth. But still, the argument is that there are injustices today. I mean, the Bible tells us to be loving, to be caring, to do justice, to love each other. How does one kind of bring to separate the biblical call to love, to be compassionate, from what is being advocated for in critical theory, in advocated for addressing injustices and looking after minorities, looking after oppressed groups? I mean, could not the argument be that the likes of yourself are being selfish and big for not conceding to what is the call for looking after those who need help?
Great question. So I think that what I would point out is that if ever anybody uses any language about care for the oppressed, we should internally give thanks to God, because any expression of concern for those who are oppressed reflects the fact that all human beings, whether they acknowledge it or not, are made in the image of God and have been given a conscience. God has wired up every single human being made in his image with a conscience that at some points tells us to care for other people. And we should give thanks to God for that. We should give praise to God for that. So that's the first point to make. The second point to make is that true compassion, true care, true love has to be based on an objective standard. And we can give thanks to God that he has put in the conscience of people actually some glimmers of his moral law, perfectly expressed in the Ten Commandments. And that is the objective standard for justice. And of course, in a sinful world, we more than anyone understand that there is sin in the world. I have sin in my own heart. There is sin in the heart of every human being. And all sin will be held to account as we look out on the gross injustices and evils and disparities and terrible things that happen in the world. We know that there will be a judgment. We know that God is just. We know that we ourselves will come under judgment. And we also hold out good news that forgiveness is freely offered to all through the Lord Jesus Christ. So absolutely, we should be ourselves praying for and working against injustice and oppression. But I have to tell you that through history and in the world today, it's very often Bible-believing Christians who are on the front lines of currently the greatest evil at the moment is human trafficking caused by sex slavery and prostitution and pornography. And Christians oppose pornography and prostitution, which drives it. And you've got Christians on the front line in many countries risking their own lives to try and help those who are genuinely being unjustly treated. So there's a good story to tell about what Christians have done and are still doing. I actually have written a separate book about that, how Christianity transformed the world. But the only real basis for caring for those disadvantaged people is the conviction that they are all made in the image of God. And so the poorest child being abused by rich people in some terrible context, that child is made in the image of God. And that person has dignity. And that's why we care for all. Whereas once you deny the Creator God, you actually then end up dehumanizing those groups who you say are the oppressor groups. And again, in front of me, I have some various variations of this wheel of power and privilege. And you end up saying that those people with convictions about, for example, biblical morality, they are oppressing those people who don't live according to those norms, and their views should not be tolerated. Well, that's because you've removed the idea of absolute truth, absolute morality, and a creator God. So I would question the real impact of the critical theorists on actual social injustice. If you look at Marx, for example, he said he cared for the oppressed. And then you look at his own life and how things worked out in his life. It's very, very ironic that he sat in the British Library writing about the oppressed. He didn't go out into factories or mills or workplaces to talk to them or find out about their condition. He really only ever had one worker that he had first-hand contact with, his own household servant, a woman called Lenchen, and she was never paid a wage. She was only given board and lodging. He treated her abominably. He made her pregnant. He made her put the baby, give the baby away. He oppressed the one worker he ever had personal contact with. And then you look at Foucault, right? He talked about oppression to some extent, but we now know that it's when he was living in North Africa, he abused young boys in that context. He was a rich man abusing young boys, giving them pathetic little bits of money. A tragic story. And then Foucault actually, I said Marx said there's no truth, no morality, no religion. Foucault said all knowledge is simply constructed by the powerful to keep them in positions of power. And he said that all institutions, such as hospitals and mental asylums and prisons, are there to keep oppressed people under. And he challenged medical knowledge, saying it's bio knowledge and there to keep doctors in power. But his life was tragic. And when he was dying of AIDS, he relied on the skillful care, compassion, concern, and knowledge of doctors in La Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, which he had previously denounced as an oppressive institution. So when you look at the actual lives of these theorists, there's an awful lot of pontificating about caring for people, but not a great deal of evidence of it in their own lives. And the ideas unravel in hard reality.
Okay, I want to come back to your point about absolute truth, about being a sovereign God. I mean, this is a benchmark by which people can choose to live their lives by if they want. But the reality is, one way or the other, is that a lot of people in the world don't follow the benchmark you speak of, the benchmark of Christianity, the benchmark of the Bible, of God's word. So this is an alternative view. How do you kind of manage this? How do you say society should manage this? We can't just go out and say you have to believe, you have to follow what we believe. I mean, that's the argument that will come back against you. So I mean, this is the alternative that's proposed. Well, look, we all have to live together in one world. So this is what we have to do. We have to look after the minorities. We have to watch our language. We have to shape and mold how we live to protect everybody, because we don't want a benchmark. We don't have a benchmark. So we have to work our way. So, I mean, this is the argument that people will throw. Will it not be that? Well, look, this is just, let's all live in a happy world. Let's be inclusive. Let's be caring. So, I mean, are you not selfish and bigoted for coming up against this argument?
That's a very interesting way of putting it. And I'll make a point to begin with, which is that historically, the firmest foundation for liberty of conscience is actually the truly biblical worldview, because every human being made in God's image will be answerable to God at the last day for what they believe and what they think. And the Bible teaches that that includes rulers as well as ruled. And no ruler has the right to tell me what to think and how to worship. And that's the basis on which, when the apostles are told to stop preaching the gospel, they say we must obey God rather than men. And if a ruler tells me how to worship, for example, I can say, no, I'm answerable to God for how I worship. That's not up to a ruler. Rulers can limit certain behaviors which harm other people, and God has given them that responsibility, but not tell me what to do with my worship and my heart. Through history, Christianity's been a good basis for liberty of conscience and religion. But then you say, well, what about how we treat other people? And I again go to the fact that we're still blessed in our societies to be living off the capital of a civilization based on the biblical worldview, which actually framed much of God's moral law in our commands. We say, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, and so on. And once that worldview collapses, I find it very telling now that you've got atheists such as Richard Dawkins saying, I don't believe in God, but I actually think we need cultural Christianity. Well, sorry, you can't have it both ways. You've been chopping off the branch on which we've been sitting, and now the branch is falling down, and you're saying you wish the branch could get stuck back on. And you have non-Christian commentators such as, for example, two very excellent feminist writers, Louise Perry and Mary Harrington, both lamenting the complete breakdown of norms surrounding family and saying women and children are suffering. Oh, but no, we don't actually believe in God and the Bible on which those family norms were based, but we would like those family norms back again. And they are saying it's a bit alarming. We seem to be reverting to a new paganism. Well, I tell you what, if we do revert and go back in that trajectory towards paganism, it's going to be darker, it's going to be more violent, there's going to be more suffering of women, more suffering of children. And it's the biblical norms of stable family life, marriage, etc., which these people are saying now, oh, we're losing this. We wish we weren't, but how do we get back to it? Okay. Well, actually, we go back to it if we say, let's respect the norms that God has laid out for us, because they're for our good. Our Creator God gave us his manual for living because he loves us and he knows what works well for us. And I think we've got a good story to tell.
Okay, let's just. I want to just go back to the point about, you mentioned that word, but the culture we're living in, Ireland and the UK, this part of the world. We could argue well that, of course, people could say, "Look, I'm not a Christian. I'm an atheist. I'm an agnostic. I'm whatever." But the culture of these lands is basically rooted in Christianity. It's a cultural Christian country, culture, society. So this is changing now, of course, more and more. But nevertheless, this is the culture that our society is founded on. You reference in your work atheist and co-author of Cyclical Theories, James Lindsay. He was right. He was warning Christian leaders that social justice, that is, of course, critical theory, aims to destroy Christianity from within. Speak to us about this in terms of our changing language, our changing society, our changing approach. What is your view on this in terms of not just destroying Christianity from within, but of course the culture, the society that is founded upon Christianity?
Well, a culture that is founded on Christianity is founded on the belief that God created all people equally in his image. And that is the true foundation for believing in human dignity. And it's the true foundation for wanting to protect human life. And so I would simply say, if you look at the issue of protection of life, for around 2,000 years, we've had a culture of care in medicine that said doctors must do no harm, they must preserve life, they're not allowed to take life. And the assumption was that doctors should not kill, they should not abort unborn children, and they should do all possible to preserve life. Now, when you throw out the idea of a creator God and that every human life has dignity because made in his image, and you just go down the materialistic route, well, frankly, if you go along with the humanist Bronowski, humans are just on a spectrum with nature and we're no different to a stone or a cactus or a camel. Well, what's special and sacred about human life? Precisely nothing. And we are on a slippery slope towards a culture of death where globally untold millions of unborn babies are aborted every year. And in several jurisdictions now, there's so-called assisted suicide, assisted dying, or euthanasia, which effectively leaves frail, elderly, and vulnerable people feeling as if they might have a duty to shuffle off this mortal coil to leave the resources to younger people. It's a heavily dark culture of erosion of respect for human life that we are moving into, because we are moving away from those Christian foundations. And then one could talk about whole other areas of life as well. But I think that there are an increasing number of non-Christians who are looking around with alarm and saying, well, what quite have we thrown away when we threw away those Christian ideals? But James Lindsay, to go back to him, I find him extremely interesting because he's an atheist, but he looks at some of the darker manifestations of critical theory. And he, like I, am very concerned about child protection. And one of the darker manifestations is to regard anybody who is oppressed because their lifestyles are not celebrated and endorsed as a victim. And I have in front of me a charmed circle, or yes, it's the charmed circle from the foundational text for queer theory by Gail Rubin, published in 1992, Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. And this just is absolutely upfront that people who are attracted to minors, cross-generational attraction, that's an oppressed minority, and they should never, ever have their claims challenged or questioned. And it's a frank and upfront apologetic for paedophilia. Now, James Lindsay has been excellent in just exposing a lot of this manifestation of critical gender theory. And he's saying, look, this is not good news for children. It really is not good news for children. And he's very concerned about the outworkings of that. And he's saying that many Christians are naive to what's going on, because if somebody says, well, I'm oppressed, as Christians, we don't want to seem to be on the wrong side. But those claims of oppression can be covering some quite dark realities.
You made the point, Sharon, about earlier on that atheist we spoke about. His name is James Lindsay. He was speaking about that critical theory was going to destroy Christianity from within. Just going back a few years, Ireland in recent years had two referendums. One was marriage equality, one was abortion. Those who were advocating against a yes vote for marriage equality were making the point, well, look, redefining marriage is not going to make marriage equal between all. And likewise, those who were against abortion were arguing, well, look, the baby in the womb is a human being. To kill the human being is murder. Murder is wrong. So I suppose there was a benchmark by which people worked against. Now, of course, that could have been a Christian benchmark. It could have been even an atheist benchmark intrinsic in somebody's mind and heart. But nevertheless, there was a benchmark of right and wrong. As life continues, as, of course, language continues to be redefined, even words like phobia, words like the whole multitude of words that are acceptable and not acceptable now, how is this going to shape and mold society in terms of our interactions, in terms of how we talk? This you mentioned earlier on about a slippery slide. Speak to us a bit about this.
When you look historically, the most solid foundation for defending human rights has been the understanding that every human life should be respected because every human life is an individual created by God with dignity. And when you lose hold of that objective marker, it's all too easy to treat human beings as simply human material. If you think of Karl Marx, he didn't believe in God. He hated the idea of God. And he effectively regarded humans as human material. And what was good, he defined what was good for the revolution. And his ideology, some reckon, led to the elimination of 148 million people during the 20th century. And then if you look at the idea that actually we're just human material, we're just matter, we've just evolved, well, why not abort the unborn? Why not euthanize the elderly? The value of life becomes defined in terms of your utility, your or enjoyment, or other factors which are entirely subjective. And we're on very, very dangerous ground there. So I think that whether people say they are Christian or not, they should be grateful for living in a worldview that broadly has respect of the dignity of all human being. And the solid foundation for that is biblical truth. And we need a benchmark. By what standard? Otherwise, it literally becomes the most powerful making decisions for other people. Power wins. We'd say no. Jesus Christ gave the wonderful example of serving the weak and prioritizing the weak. But that comes from the example of our Lord Jesus Christ, his self-giving love, as well as the unchanging moral law of God.
Okay. You were speaking about the dangers of critical theory, the changing environment in which we live and interact. But how do you ensure that your call for the rejection of this roads we're going down, this critical theory, the changing and morphing society and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, your call for a rejection, particularly by Christians, of rejection of critical theory, how do you ensure that this doesn't actually alienate individuals who see you in actually the whole challenging the whole power structures? And indeed, of course, the whole idea is this, could this possibly end up hindering evangelism and even dialogue with those who are outside of the church? Could such a stance maybe even prioritize cultural conflict, even over the Great Commission to actually make disciples of all nations?
Well, I find that fascinating, because I think that when you look at living Christianity, anyone who is truly united with Jesus Christ, filled with the Spirit, loves neighbour, and living Christians will be living in communities that show genuine love, care, and concern for those around them. So Jesus says there's a simple truth for my true followers, and it's by their fruits you know them. Do they produce good fruits? And the Bible is full of clear teaching that even if you can speak with the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, that is worthless. So living Christianity, if it's truly following Jesus, will care for the needy, will clothe the naked, will feed the hungry, will be caring for those who are oppressed. But the standard of saying somebody is oppressed is God's standard. They are being unjustly treated. Now, look at the current critical social justice redefinition of oppression. And the redefinition of oppression is those who feel somehow marginalized because of the moral norms of others. And that includes what are called, for example, in the iteration of the wheel of privilege I have in front of me, those experiencing cross-generational sex attraction. Well, frankly, the real word for that is paedophilia, and that is wrong. But we know that is wrong because there is an absolute standard by which Christians would say sexual activity outside of marriage is wrong, and absolutely never with children. There is an absolute firm moral standard. But if we just have to take what everybody says about their own orientation and their own identity and go with that, that's very slippery ground, very slippery sand. And I think that even non-Christians are beginning to, like James Lindsay, are beginning to wake up to the dark consequences of that.
Okay, it's quite interesting. You've mentioned that term, a slippery slope, slippery ground, quite a number of times, and indeed, that's the environment we're in, the environment we're changing, the environment we're living in. What was acceptable is now not acceptable, and what wasn't acceptable is now acceptable. So things are changing quite fast. We've spoken about quite a bit today. This topic is very broad. Author, conference speaker, and social policy analyst with the Christian Institute, Dr. Sharon James. Thank you for your time today.
Been very interesting talking to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to go into what sounds like a really academic issue, but hopefully our conversation has shown that it has real life consequences. Thank you so much, Arthur.